entitled this way. Listen to this. What happens when you ask questions? When you study scripture, do you, in fact, ask questions? Well, what we want to discuss is the difference and the expansion of your knowledge that comes when you ask questions and take time to track them down, track answers down. We're going to begin this time by looking at Christmas in July. Now, we just went through the Advent seasons, what, 7 months ago? Well, let's do it again, at least a bit of it. Let's do it by looking at Matthew 2, the first two verses, and see what we get. You're going to find in these two verses, there's a ton of individual pieces that we'll want to consider. It says this, now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. Ton of terms in there. Jesus, Bethlehem, if you wish, Herod, Magi, from the east, King of the Jews, born King of the Jews. Let's take a look at some of those by starting out with this simple question. Where qualifies as being from the east? What are we talking about? China? Japan? Korea? Well, I don't think so. If I look in a Bible encyclopedia, though at least the one I used, from the east likely refers to the region from Parthia to Assyria to Babylon to Persia, essentially the region that we typically call Mesopotamia. In today's words, we might say, well, it goes from Armenia in Russia to Syria to Iraq to Iran. That particular segment of real estate. Well, if we're satisfied that that's probably where they came from, the next question is, who were they? Who were the Magi? Well, again, check a Bible encyclopedia and it tells me a number of things about them. It doesn't tell me specifically who they are, who these men were, especially at Jesus' time, because the first thing I find out is that they began apparently as a pagan priesthood in Media. And that Media refers to the section of the Medes and Persians, which is a section of territory in the upper part of Persia. And this was during the 600s BC, between 700 and 600 BC, that they got their beginning. Their religion fluctuated, but it was predominantly pagan, even occultic. The men themselves tended to be wealthy, and over time, they attained considerable political influence and power. They were known as kingmakers. Well, that influence waned for a while, but at the time of Jesus' birth, there were still spots where they had regained power and influence, particularly in Persia, which would be modern day Iran, of course. Listen to this way these guys dressed. See if you recognize this. They tended to dress in white robes, long white robes, with tall conical hats that had large ear flaps all the way down to their chin. That trigger any images for you? It ought to. By the 500s BC, between 600 and 500 BC, They seem to have been prevalent in Persia, Babylon, and Parthia. And they became eventually the state religion of Persia, and that was known as Zoroastrianism. The guys themselves were diviners, soothsayers, interpreters of dreams, interpreters of omens. They were astrologers, foretellers of the future. They were sorcerers. They were augurs, Augurs, term you might want to look up. But this was a characteristic of these guys, virtually all pagan kinds of things. So what do you think? Could there have been Jews in this bunch that came to see Jesus? You know, they had to have some reason to come, some way of knowing. Well, it's doubtful that they were practicing Jews in good standing. Look at Deuteronomy 18, starting in verse 10. It says this, and this is God's instruction to the Jews just before they entered the promised land. There must never be found among you anyone who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire as a burnt offering. Anyone who practices divination, there's the first one of those characteristics. They were diviners. And omen readers, they read omens. A soothsayer, a sorcerer, there you are again. One who casts spells, one who conjures up spirits, a practitioner of the occult, there's those guys again, or a necromancer, of course, someone who communicates with the dead, so to speak. Verse 12, whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord, and because of these things, the Lord your God is about to drive them out of the land before you. Those issues were characteristic of the Canaanites that they were going to dispossess from the land. It continues in verse 13. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. Those nations that you are about to dispossess listen to omen readers and diviners. They listen to people like the Magi. But the Lord your God has not given you permission to do those things. In other words, don't go there. Clearly, those guys that came to visit Jesus couldn't have been practicing Jews in good standing. Now, they may have been Jewish by ethnicity, but they weren't Jewish by religion. That would seem almost clear. You may get a bit of a surprise here in a second, though. So I'm going to ask this question. Is there any scriptural evidence that any Israelite was ever a magi? I asked the question a minute ago and said if they were, they could have been in good standing. Was there ever one who was in it? The answer is yes. And it was an Israelite in very good standing. As a matter of fact, his name is attached to the book called Daniel. In Daniel chapter 4, in verses 8 and 9, we read this. Later, Daniel entered, whose name was Belteshazzar, after the name of my God is evidently Nebuchadnezzar speaking of Daniel. Daniel had been renamed, given a Babylonian name. Remember when the guys that were brought from Israel to Babylon that were of the aristocracy or the nobility or showed specific talents, they were attempted to be put into king's court and made into practicing Babylonians. Well, that didn't happen, of course, with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, so he said, I named him Belteshazzar after my God, after the name of my God, and in whom there is a spirit of the holy gods, talking back about Daniel now. So Nebuchadnezzar realized something about Daniel was different. There was a spirit of one of the holy gods in Daniel. So he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, recounted my dream for him, Daniel, as well, saying, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians. You catch that? Not only was Daniel a magi, he was the head of all magi's in Babylon, in whom I know there to be a spirit of the holy gods, and whom no mystery baffles. Consider my dream, Daniel, that I saw, and set forth his interpretation. He knew Daniel could do better than the Magi, the things the Magi were trained and asked to do. Daniel could simply outperform him because God was with him. Now, under a different king, we get the same piece of information. This was Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son, and the guy with in the middle of this handwriting on the wall business, and that's where this takes place. And it goes this way. It's the queen mother, Belshazzar's mother, speaking to him. There is a man in your kingdom who has within him a spirit of the holy gods. As the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, she picked this up. In the days of your father, Nebuchadnezzar, he proved to have insight, Daniel, that is, discernment and wisdom like that of the gods. They recognized that this was a God-given wisdom and ability in Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, appointed him chief of the magicians, astrologers, wise men, and diviners. So where is Daniel? Leading a bunch of people who were directly opposed to his religion in their own pagan religion. And you can go on from there, and it just talks about the quality of Daniel. But here is Daniel. He's not in the lion's den now, but he's in a den of magi who are pathetic, not worse than that. And he can outperform them, but now he is their boss. So don't get overly concerned if at work you get mixed up with people who don't believe the way you do. You simply conduct your business according to God's will. Were there other Jews among the Magi of Babylon? Well, we don't have scriptural proof of it, but some scholars and historians believe there were such Jews. We do know, for example, there were Israelites high in the power structure. How about that? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the fiery furnace trio. They were promoted, and you go to Daniel 2, last part of Daniel 2, first half of Daniel 3, you will find that they, after they came out of that fiery furnace, they were promoted into administrative positions, high-level administrative positions. So were they among the Magi? Likely not. But that certainly tells you it's possible there were Jews in that collection along with Daniel. Now, when we go back to the story where the Magi are going through Jerusalem, ask the question, we tend to take that question the Magi's ask and assume that they delivered this question directly to Herod. But it doesn't seem that that's necessarily the case. As a matter of fact, I don't believe it was the case. When you look at the Greek word for the word saying, they were saying, who is born king of the Jews? How do we find him? That saying in the Greek is a tense that implies a continuous action. What does that make you believe? Evidently, they went all over Jerusalem asking anybody they bumped into, hey, do you know where we can find this king of the Jews were looking for, this one who was relatively young, just being born? Evidently, that's what they were doing. There's no indication they ever went to Herod to ask that question. Uh, that would have put things in a bit of an uproar. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. In verse 3 of chapter 2, Matthew, it says, and when Herod heard it, of the Magi's activity, that is, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Well, let's look at them separately. Let's take the average Jew in Jerusalem. Here comes some foreigners, great big monstrous entourage, probably a cavalry protector, riding with them. And this Jew is saying, well, look, I've been praying for a long time for my Messiah to come and free us from Roman domination. The idea of the fact that the Messiah might be here would have been not only upsetting, it would have been exciting. And to top it off, if this Messiah is the king of the Jews, then the foreigner who was now their king had to go. What a bonus that would have been. Because look at Herod. He was known as the king of the Jews. He was appointed by Rome. He bought his way into it, conniving, bribery, that sort of thing. He was, I said he was a foreigner. He was most likely what's called Idumean or Idumean, which would have been south of Judea, between Judea and Egypt a bit. And he probably was a descendant of Esau. Translation, he ain't no Jew. But yet there he is as king of the Jews. Not only that, he was a violent man. He executed a lot of close family members, including some of his own children. If they challenged him for influence and power, they're done. He tolerated no challenges. So, by the way, have you ever thought, what is Abraham called? The father of the Jews or the father of Israel? But Israel is never called the house of Abraham. It's never called the house of Isaac, but it is called the house of Jacob. Know why? I don't know that I have any proof of this, but think about it for a minute. Abraham had how many sons? 8, 7 of whom were not sons of the covenant promise. Only Isaac was the son of the covenant promise. Translation, Abraham's offspring gave rise to 7 non-Israelite people groups. So when you talk about the house of Abraham, do you want to only talk about Israel? You want to talk about Israel, Midianites, Arabs? Who do you want to include in the house of Abraham? It's a lot more than the nation of Israel. And the same with Isaac, with Isaac. Because he had 2 sons, right? Esau was the son who was the head of a non-Jewish nation called Edom. And so evidently, there's a good chance at least that Herod was an Edomite. He was a descendant of Esau. But when you look at Jacob, every one of his sons was a patriarch of the 12 tribes of Israel, one of the tribes at least of the 12. Well, it says Herod was troubled. Well, I expect he was. First of all, he wanted no competition, which we talked about earlier. But after the Magi went all over Jerusalem, and Herod probably picked that up from somebody reporting. But why was he troubled outside of the fact that this coming Messiah would likely take his throne? Let's look in chapter 2, verse 7. Okay. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and ascertained from them the time of that the star appeared. So he wanted information from them, so he called them in. He had heard about it, so he calls them in. Herod knew he had no newborn son who might be king by inheritance then. But any other child who was born king of the Jews would be a competitor for Herod's crown. So there's your competition. He ain't gonna want no part of that. He was a man who could not tolerate any competition. But there's more to it than that. It would cause the uproar. Again, think of the caravan. We don't know how far they came, but it was a long distance. The people estimated they may have traveled as much as 2 years to get there from wherever that might have been. I don't know whether that's true or not. But their caravan would have had to have been a sizable caravan. And remember, maybe we haven't talked about this so much. Those people in the Mesopotamian area, particularly the Parthians, had been at war with Rome. I mean, standing toe to toe with Rome in their countries, going to war with them. So here they come, some of them with a huge entourage, probably with a military escort, a cavalry escort, coming through Roman territories. You can almost bet they'd had an escort for protection. This humongous group comes right into the middle of Jerusalem. Scare the pants off the average person, I would guess. And Herod may even have said there, whoa, wait a minute. They probably sent this caravan in here to cause a ruckus of some kind, cause some kind of an incident that would give them an excuse to come in here and attack me. We don't know that, but it's certainly a possibility because of all of the fighting that had been going on and off for years. But there's another thing which is kind of neat. Think about Herod. Here we are, we got all these foreigners coming into town in their big entourage, hollering, who is the one born the king of the Jews? And what's Herod's title? King of the Jews. This is like walking up, Herod smack him in the face and says, where's the real guy who's king of the Jews? You ain't him. Maybe a little more subtle than I'm making it, but I think it would have been another thing that would tick Herod off a whole lot. Well, we know the rest of the Magi's story. Of course, they found Jesus. They worshiped him as they said they came to do. They lavished on him very valuable gifts that probably supported Joseph, Mary, and Jesus during their time in Egypt, although we don't know how long they were there, probably wasn't very long. And then they left, avoiding another incident with Herod. It says they went home another way. But if you go back and look at that part where they were told to not go back to Herod, how were they told? Remember, these guys were diviners. They were dream interpreters. They received information, communication, and visions and dreams. That visions and dreams were the way they got everything they had, generally not from Yahweh. So how did God give them the instruction to not go back to Herod? He gave him a dream. He said, okay, it's the way you guys learned. I'll step in here, give you a real statement from the Lord of the world. He says, don't go back there. But there's one question that all we've done today is set up this question. I want you to think about that because next time we want to milk this question for all it's worth, and it will take us all the way back to Genesis. Here's the question. Why did the Magi follow that star? Did you ever ask yourself that question? Well, we'll take a look at it next time.